Dee Dee, I've been doing this series on the names of God, and I know that Dee Dee's been going through an awful lot of stuff, and so I talked to Dee Dee, how many weeks ago was it? Like maybe 5 weeks ago, Dee Dee? Something like that? And I said, Dee Dee, one of the sermons that I'm doing is on the name El Roi, and it means the God who sees. The God who sees what's going on. And I said, Dee Dee, with all the stuff that's been going on in your life, would you mind telling some of your story? And so Dee Dee said, not over my dead body. Now, actually, she said, you know what, I'd be happy to do that, but she's scared to death, I'm sure. But anyway, it's just, I know you're going to share something what God has given to you. So, Dee Dee, why don't you share your story about how God sees you? Even before you started. They don't do that for me.
For my family's sake, I want you to know I made it up here without tripping and falling. A few weeks back, Pastor John touched on the story of Elisha and his servant back in 2 Kings 6, 15 through 17. If you want to read that and follow along with what I have to tell you. He also told the story of our Ryan Vay praying over his friend until the spirit of doubt and depression left him, which was such a miracle. We too have had a miracle in our family, and I wanted you to know about that. I'm not a person who understands those kind of subjects, the subject of healing very well. Neither do I want to delve into it like some people in different churches do. I come from a Dutch Reformed church, so this church is kind of wild to me. But today I want to talk about spiritual eyes, which is a phrase that has come alive in my life. Back in the day, the king of Aram was at war with Israel. The Arameans were a mighty army and many in number. Yet Israel always seemed to possess advanced knowledge of the military plans of the Aramean army. Frustrated, the king began to suspect that there was a traitor among his top officials. He became enraged. He called his officers together and yelled, "Tell me, which of you is on the side of Israel?" "None of us, my lord," said one official. "But the prophet Elisha, who is in Israel, tells the king there the very words that you speak in your bedroom." The king ordered them to capture Elisha by night. Early the next morning, Elisha's servant looked out and saw all the enemies and their chariots outside of their camp. He said, "Oh, my Lord, what shall we do?" Elisha prayed that God would give his servant spiritual eyes, and he said to his servant, "More is with us than are with them." The servant looked out again and saw God's mighty army camped all around them. Oddly enough, I had just started a Bible study called The Armor of God by Priscilla Schreier, which has been God's perfect timing in my life. This passage is the first one that she broke into in this study. So I got it here from church, and I got it from Priscilla Schreier. She mentioned Elisha's servant got an eyeful at first. The only thing the servant saw was the enemy, who is our enemy, which likely left him with no response other than fear and anxiety. Most of you know that we in our family have literally been cancered to death. I didn't think I was going to do this. In the last 5 years, we've lost 6 family members, and the hardest being our beautiful granddaughter Kaylee, Kara's twin, losing her battle with a brain tumor. We've lost 8 of our neighbors and friends. I myself have had uterine cancer, and my husband Glenn recently having 2 major surgeries back to back, fighting lung cancer, with another one coming up. Our daughter Brenda, right now, has been battling ovarian cancer for the last 7 years and is now in the hardest battle of all, as the future looks very bleak. Since Glenn's surgeries this past winter, they've been keeping a close eye on him. They believed there was still a small spot on his other lung that they were going to watch. 7 weeks ago, he went in for a routine scan, and the doctor came back with I'm sorry, Glenn, but it appears this spot is growing. We want to do a PET scan. In the PET scan, they fill you with a contrast that goes throughout your body, and wherever the cancer is, it will show up a brilliant blue, and the spot showed blue. But to our surprise and dismay, so did the lymph nodes in his bronchial passageways. The verdict was, I'm sorry, Glenn, but the cancer has spread. We need to do a biopsy. And if it's cancer, we can't handle that with surgery. It's inoperable. It will have to be chemo and radiation, which we did not want at all. Feelings of helplessness, defeat, and anxiety flooded in our whole family, and we found no way of escape, which is exactly where the enemy wants us to be. Oddly enough, I was in the first lesson of my Bible study. I'm studying with a couple of other ladies. And I went to our meeting in tears because we found out that very day. Then we began to unfold our lesson, the armor of God. She writes, after the servant of Elisha, his first reaction was fear and anxiety. He immediately became tuned in to the game-changing spiritual reality. More was at his disposal and working on his behalf than he could ever imagine. What his physical eyes could see were no match for what they couldn't see. Elisha's prayer helped make him aware of all the resources and strength on his side. To be confident and victorious, you've got to be able to see it. This passage was calling me to take myself out of my situation I was in and to look within it. She asked, what is the most overwhelming circumstance I was currently in my life, and what am I currently wrestling with? I kept coming up with cancer and fear and cancer. And then she said, these are not the real enemy. That really stood out to me. Everything that occurs in this visible, physical world is directly connected to the wrestling match being waged in the visible spiritual world. She said the devil wants you to ignore the spiritual reality behind the physical one. Being a believer gives us access to the power of the Father, and that victory in spiritual warfare is inseparable from prayer. We've been given everything to send the enemy running for cover. Utilizing the spiritual resources we have been given, that we have been given is to have our spiritual eyes open so that we can see him. She said, victory starts here, and it starts today. Well, I'm here to tell you that it's a good thing that I was home alone the next morning. Because I rose up from my chair, just like the little grandma in the movie in the War Room, if you've seen it. I began yelling at the devil out loud, you have no power over my man. He belongs to Jesus, and Jesus is the great physician and the healer of mankind. So Satan, you are not welcome here. In the name of Jesus Christ, leave my husband alone, leave my family alone, and go back to where you came from. I also began earnestly praying, God, open my eyes. Please give me spiritual eyes as you did Elisha's servant. Help me see as you see. I need to see over and above my circumstances right now so I can survive this thing one more time. I began looking up different scriptures to prove to myself that indeed God does want for us to see as he sees, not as much as he sees, because we could not ever handle that. God sees the spiritual world, that's where he resides. God sees, and it is his desire that we see as well. I began to see a whole different way of praying that I've never seen before. Prayers filled with more faith and more power. Then we went for the biopsy results. The doctor said, Glenn, I have good news. The results are negative. The bad news is a negative result is only 95% sure. So we have to do another more intense biopsy to rule out the other 5%. And I thought, okay, another couple of weeks of waiting and testing. But more importantly, will my faith and my power praying remain consistent? I prayed out loud as often as I could and shouted at the devil every time I was alone. We went back for the second set of results for the doctor, and he came in and said, I have good news, Glenn. And he said it too was negative. So now that we knew that in his bronchial tubes there was no cancer, I just bowed my head and I said, thank you, Jesus. We still have to go take care of that little spot on his lung on the 10th of next month. They can do that robotically with a 3-day stay in the hospital. Then he can come home cancer-free. Praise the Lord. I knew this was a miracle. I knew it could have been a mistake. It could have been something else, but I knew it was a miracle. And then God gave me a confirmation to the fact that this really was a miracle when one of the doctors involved, that is a Christian, said, I know what I know, and I know what I saw, and this is straight from Jesus. When we open the eyes of our body, we see danger. But when we open the eyes of our faith, we see the Lord's mighty army. God sees. And although we could never handle seeing all that he sees, we can certainly continually pray that he would give us spiritual eyes so that we can see more than we see today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dee Dee, for sharing that. You know, when I asked Dee Dee to share that story, that was well before they had gotten these results. And it was because Dee Dee kept saying, you know what, I just kept praying, God, give me eyes to see what you're doing. Give me eyes to see what you're doing every day. Give me eyes to see what you're doing. And God did. God is always seeing us. Always, always seeing us. Did you know that this past week, August 16th, was a very special day? You know how every day has its own thing. Do you have any water? I'm Meanwhile, back at the ranch, August 16th was a very special day. I don't know if you were aware of it. It was called Surveillance Day. I don't know, have anybody celebrate anything specifically on Surveillance Day? In fact, what you're supposed to do on Surveillance Day is wave and do something funny to a surveillance camera. That's what you're supposed to do. August 16th is the day. We passed it, so you got to mark it in your calendar next year. But next year, when August 16th shows up, find a camera, do something wild and crazy, just to give maybe the person who is observing you something funny to do, or something funny to laugh about. But that's the day. Did you know that you and I, on average, are caught on about 75 different cameras a day? 75, roughly about 75 different surveillance cameras catch you on any given day. How does that make you feel? Cared for, loved, cuddled, yeah. So often when we think about being watched, it's like this big brother idea. I don't want to be watched like that. I want privacy. I want to do my own thing. Until you get that package delivered from Amazon, and it ends up on your front porch, which is where it's supposed to be. And you see the little email that comes in. It was delivered at X amount of time, and you come home, and that package is gone. And at that moment, you think to yourself, if only there was a camera that caught that person, because I would love to know who stole my package. That's the picture. When we see this thing of surveillance and everything else, like I said, the idea of being watched 75 times, which, by the way, don't get too upset about that. They say that people who live in London are caught an average of 300 times a day on cameras. So we have a long way to go, but it's not going to get much better, I would think. The idea, though, is we are always being watched. And when things are going good, and we're the good people, we're happy when people are always watching on the cameras to catch all those mean people who were road raging down the street, and that we caught those people until you're the one who's tempted to road rage. And then you're really hoping there was no camera around. You see, here's what I want you to understand. There's a name of God that we're going to get at today, and that is this one in the middle, El Roi. Now, actually, it looks like Elroy. I've been saying Elroy for a long time because I hadn't looked it up as to what it was supposed to be. So in my mind, I'm thinking Elroy from the Jetsons. How many of you are aware of Elroy from the Jetsons? That's what I'm thinking in my mind, Elroy. Well, it's not Elroy. You have to block that out of your mind. So if you think about his name, think not Elroy from the Jetsons. Think El-Roi. El-Roi, that's the way you say this thing. But literally what it means is the God who sees, or it's the God who sees me. The thing is, God always sees you. How many of you are really happy about that? Depends on the day, right? You're living close to God, things are doing good, you're committed to Him. God, I want all of you in my life. Help me throughout my day. How many of you are so excited God sees you? Yeah. You're living in rebellion against God. You're kind of frustrated with Him because it seems like He's doing nothing. I'm going to go over here, I'm going to sow my wild oats for a while. God's always watching you. How many of you are excited about that? It's kind of this idea. God's always seeing us. And yet I'll tell you this. Sometimes it doesn't feel like it. Sometimes it doesn't feel like it. And in order to talk about this, I want us to go to Genesis chapter 16. Genesis chapter 16. And it's here that we find this name given. One of the only places in the Bible, very few times is actually this name even referenced. But it's mentioned right here in Genesis chapter 16. And we encounter a lady by the name of Hagar. Hagar. If you've been in church before, you've probably heard of a guy by the name of Abraham. Abraham is a really big, important figure in the Old Testament, as he is really the father, and as we would say, the father of the nation of Israel. He was God's chosen guy to say, God says to you, Abraham, it's through you that all the world's going to be blessed. I'm going to give you a descendant, and I'm going to give you descendants. And the descendants are the people of Israel. The descendant, the seed that was being specifically talked about, was Jesus, the Son of God, who would come, take on flesh, be born of a woman who was a Jew, be born of a woman and live a sinless life and die for our sins, and then rise again. And so it's through you, Abraham, that I want to bless the world. Now the thing is, when Abraham heard this promise, he was already relatively old at the time. But God gave him the promise, and Abraham, he believes it. He believes the promise. God, okay, I'm relatively old. He was up in his 70s right around this time when he's given this promise. All right, God, I know I'm in my 70s. My wife's in her 60s. But, all right, I'm going to believe you. I'm going to believe that you're going to give me all sorts of descendants. Doesn't make much sense, but I'm going to do it anyway. Years go by. Time goes by. The clock is ticking. If their biological clock was bad to start with, it's worse now. Things are not the way they should be if Abraham and Sarah want to have a baby. And yet God says this is what He's going to do. And so Sarah, or her name here at this point in time was Sarai, chapter 16, verse 1. We can pick up the story. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. But she had an Egyptian maidservant named Hagar. So she said to Abram, "The Lord has kept me from having children. Go, sleep with my maidservant. Perhaps I can build a family through her." Now this seems weird to us today, simply because this doesn't happen, okay, at least here in America. It doesn't happen. We don't have maidservants, and in no way, shape, or form, even if you did have somebody who came and cleaned your house and took care of things, in no way, shape, or form do you have the ability, the authority to say, hey, go and become his wife. You don't have that. We don't have that, thankfully, today. But back in the culture of that day, it was perfectly acceptable. If you had a maidservant, and she was probably much like a slave. She lived there with them. She was purchased by them. It was their responsibility to take care of her, but they had authority over her. And so, sure enough, Sarah has this great idea. You know what? It's culturally acceptable, and not only is it acceptable, but in the day, if Hagar's kid became that child, he could become truly the identified heir. And so it was not just acceptable, sure, we'll turn the blind eye, but that could become his child. That could become that heir that would be able to be used for inheritance purposes and everything else. And so it was perfectly acceptable. So Sarah has this idea. She says, hey, I got this idea. Why don't we do this? Maybe this was how God was going to solve the problem. You're old. I'm old. Hagar, theoretically, is not very old. Maybe God brought Hagar to us for such a time as this, and then God is going to bring us the inheritance through this. Let's try it. Abram should have known better. But it says here, Abram agreed to what Sarah said. So after Abram had been living in Canaan 10 years, Sarah, his wife, took her Egyptian maidservant Hagar and gave her to her husband to be his wife. He slept with Hagar, and she conceived. So things are going as planned. Okay, here you go, Abram. This is now going to be, basically, she's going to become like a wife, but I'm still the number one wife. Okay, so she's going to become the wife, and hopefully we can get a child through her. Yes, we got a child through her. This is going great. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Oh, boy. I'm pregnant. You're not. Nah, 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 nah. Then Sarah said to Abraham, you are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. There's a phrase that the husband is always wrong no matter what. You ever heard that before? It would be really hard for me to not respond back in this case, but we're not told what Abraham says, or Abram says at the time. We're not told. In fact, all we think it is that Abram just sat there. I'm responsible. I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows she is pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Abraham's thinking to himself, I'll take that judgment. I think you're going to get more in trouble than I am because you're the one that had the brilliant idea. But he doesn't say those things. Abram wisely says, your servant is in your hands. Do with her whatever you think best. Then Sarah mistreated Hagar, so she fled from her. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur, and he said, Hagar, servant of Sarah, where have you come from? And where are you going? I'm running away from my mistress, Sarah. From my mistress, Sarah, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will so increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count. The angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now a child, and you will have a son. You shall name him Ishmael. For the Lord has heard of your misery, and he will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will live in hostility toward all of his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her, you are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well is called Beer Lahai Roi. I did it again. Beer Lahai, there it is, Roi. It is still there between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave him the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abraham was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. So there we get our timeline. We get our events of all the things that happened. And so what do we do about this? Well, here's the thing that I want you to see. Okay, here's our name, El Roi, from Genesis chapter 16. And basically what it means is this. God sees me. God sees me. He sees you. He sees me. He sees what's going on. He sees what's happening in your life and in my life. And there are times when I think God can't see this, because if he saw it, he would do something about it. And yet there are things that he's doing in the world, and there are things that he's working out that if we don't understand some of this stuff, we can think God's not watching anymore. He's not observing. He doesn't care. He doesn't love me. He's judging me. He's fill in the blank, whatever it is. But hopefully as we go through this, you can see God does see me. He sees you. And so the first thing is this. When you become the victim of other people's choices, God sees you. When you become the victim of other people's choices, think about this. What part did Hagar play in this whole thing when the whole idea first started? Nothing. Hagar was simply the maidservant. You can just picture her. She was there. She was taking care of things, taking care of Sarah, taking care of Abram, doing whatever was needed around the house, whatever was going on. Things were going fine for Hagar. She wasn't even aware of this. And you can just picture that there was some sort of a bedroom conversation between Sarah and Abram in which they were having a conversation away. Hey, you know what? I got this idea about Hagar. I had this idea about Hagar. I think that she would make a good wife for you because she's young, she's of childbearing years. How about she become your wife and then we can fix this problem because God said he would give us descendants. How about we do it? Hagar's completely oblivious, and then you picture Sarah going over to Hagar one day and saying, oh, by the way, Hagar, I have an idea for you. Oh, really? What is that? Oh, what do you want me to clean today? Well, it's really not cleaning per se. Well, what is it? I want you to be Abram's wife. What? You want me to be his wife? Yeah, I really just think that would be a way for us to solve this problem because this is what's going on. I think it would work fine. Are you sure about this? I don't know if this is such a good idea. You can just picture the conversation. You know what? Abram and I already talked about it. I think it's going to work out great. Let's just try. You know what? Come on, do it for us. Ah, man, this seems really weird, but okay, all right, we'll see how it works. These choices got Hagar in massive trouble. Massive trouble. Her life went from a standard life to this way, and now next thing you know, she's in the middle of the desert fleeing, trying to get rid of the situation. She's trying to get away. In fact, not only is she so desperate, she is running and putting herself in tremendous difficulty, tremendous way of harm. Because there's this road, because remember, where's she going to? She's going back to Egypt. She was living in the land of Canaan. She's making her way back to Egypt. Who's going with her? Nobody. Single, pregnant lady making a journey, a very dangerous journey. Trust me, back then there were no surveillance cameras, okay? Making a very dangerous journey to go back from the land of Canaan all the way back to Egypt. But she was so desperate that at that point in time, her safety wasn't even the issue. I got to get away. Maybe some of you are sitting here and you know of somebody who's in a situation in which they are in a desperate place. In some ways, it's not even any fault of their own, but other people's choices have put them into the position that they're in today. And because of these other choices, they're scared, they're freaking out, not knowing what they're supposed to do, and as a result, they're wondering, God, do you see this? If you were aware and you were looking at this, why would I be in this position in the first place? You see, there are times when we simply become the victims of other people's choices. You know, sometimes these victims are the choices of God's people. Here's another wrinkle in it. Who were Abraham and Sarah? Were these pagan people who didn't know God, didn't know how they should act, treated everybody wrongly? Who were these people? Abram and Sarah were God's people. Abram and Sarah were the equivalent of the pillars of the church. Have the pillars of the church ever let anybody down? They were the people that God was blessing. They were the people who he was staking the inheritance on. This is where we're going. This is what's going to happen. These were God's people. Of all people who should know better than not to treat people a certain way, of all the people, they failed. And who got hurt? An unbelieving pagan person. Has a non-Christian ever been hurt by a Christian? Yeah, it happens. Maybe for some of you, you said you'll never be in church again. And I know I've talked to some of you with your stories. I will never go to church again because I know what the church did to me. Because those people who claim to be the Christians, the ones who should know better, yeah, they're the ones who abused me. They're the ones who stole from me, took advantage of me, whatever else, treated me wrongly. I don't want any part of this thing. That's the thinking. You see, even when God's people let you down, God sees you. And we're going to talk about this in just a second, because is it just enough that God sees me? Okay, good. I'm glad you see me. What are you going to do about it? We're going to talk about that in a second. But I want you to hear, no matter what happens, God sees you. Even when good people, God's people, let us down. When we become the victim of other people's choices, God sees you. Here's the second lesson we take. When you need help with your choices, God sees you. You see, it's one thing when you're the victim of other people's choices. But God meets Hagar on the road at a very specific time. It says there in verse 4, he slept with Hagar and she conceived. When she knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. Remember what I talked about? Remember how she was doing it? It's written in the margins. Na. That was written in the margins. It's not in your Bible, probably. I'm just picturing that, okay? That Hagar is now making a big deal of this. That, you know what, you couldn't do this, but now I could. I'm going to bear the child. My son's going to be the firstborn. Even if God gives you something, it's going to be my child. My child. Did you get that? My child. And you can just picture Sarah thinking to herself, that was such a dumb idea that Abraham had. Such a terror. I should have never let him get away with that thing. I should have never done this. Instead, okay, so you just picture it. Hagar is thinking to herself, now I've got this thing, now I got status, whereas before I was the maidservant, now I'm the wife that brings the child. I now have an opportunity here. I'm tired of being told to do this and tired of being told to do that. You know what? I don't want to submit to her anymore. And yet, she was still in submission to her. Even though she was a wife, she was abusing that relationship. It's really interesting, even in the New Testament, when Paul is writing to slaves and masters, picture this. Back in the Roman times, there were slaves and slave owners sitting in the same service. And you can just picture that the slaves were sitting there going, yeah, there he is. I can do anything I want to because he's a Christian. He's a brother. He's just like this. I don't have to listen to him anymore. You know what? Because we're now brothers. It's not the submission thing. And yet, Paul tells the slave owners, treat your slaves with respect. Love them. Do this. Be that person. And yet he tells the slaves themselves, he says, submit. Now you think to yourself, we know better now. It's like, why in the world would we have slavery anymore? We know better. And yet there was things that were going on in the culture that had to be taken care of first. And yet, until that cultural thing was dealt with, the command was, you still need to submit. Think about it in our world today. When it comes to other people's choices, when there's a situation, whether it's a marital family or whether it's a boss, something like that at work, we get into these challenges, we get into these struggles where we think to ourselves, I am justified in rebelling. I am justified in going against this. My teacher's not very good. My teacher's not very nice. I'm justified in treating them poorly. My boss is not a very good person. I don't even really like him or her. You know what? I'm justified in treating them poorly. I may live in a marriage. I'm in a Christian marriage. I want to honor God with my life. I want to honor God with my choices. Sure, if it comes to abuse, flat out abuse, you don't have to take that. You need to go. But when it comes to simply just day-to-day stuff, there is a submitting to one another that takes place. And frankly, we don't like that. We don't like that. And yet this is what Hagar was told. The angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. Now I want you to see this real quick. The angel of the Lord found Hagar. Does that mean that God was up in heaven going, where'd she go? Where'd she go? I lost track of her. Send out the search party. Got to go looking for Hagar. We got to go find her. There she is over there. I'm so happy to see her. This is not God, okay? God is everywhere. God sees everything. The angel of the Lord in this particular case, as we've talked about numerous times, the angel of the Lord here is Jesus Christ. Just prior to taking on flesh with Mary and Joseph, okay? And so he takes on flesh, and it is there that he meets her. He meets with her. God saw the whole thing. He was there everywhere. He was aware. And yet in this whole situation, Jesus takes on flesh, and he meets Sarah, or Hagar, and he walks up to her. You can just picture it. Hagar, servant of Sarah, where have you come from? Where are you going? Let's have a conversation. And in that moment, she says, I'm running away from my mistress, Sarah. Who was to blame in this whole circumstance? Hagar or Sarah? And the answer is yes. Hagar and Sarah. Remember, it was Sarah and Abram that got into this mess in the first place, and yet whose actions God brought this thing to a head in which Sarah's like, you got to get out of here? Whose actions was it? It was Hagar's. Who's to blame in this scenario? They're all part of this disaster. Have you ever been in a situation in which you've heard somebody say, I am completely 100% not to blame for any part of this thing that's going on? And you think to yourself, yeah, right. Everybody. In every situation, there's always some piece, even if it's 0.0001%, there was still some part that you could maybe do differently. So often there's things that take place here. And yet, oftentimes in this, it's like, okay, I don't want to see the other people's side. I want to just see how have I been wrong? What can I do better? Or what can I improve on? I'm running away from my mistress, Sarah. And then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. You can just picture this. I was having a conversation this past week with Cheryl as we were getting ready for the devotional thing. I was talking to Cheryl and I said, you can just picture this. It sent chills up and down my spine as I was sitting there just even thinking what this conversation would have been like. Hagar says, oh, I don't want to. All right, I'll do it. She goes back home. She walks up to the door. Sarah comes to the door. I'm back. Oh, really? Yes, I'm back. Me and God at a moment. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said some of those things. You're darn right you shouldn't have said some of those things. I am mad. I'm angry with you. You are to blame for all these sort of things. What would you do? Would you be willing to have that conversation? What about if the person acted that way to you when you had the conversation? Now here it was. I was all trying to be nice. That's it. You've gone there now, Sarah. That's it. I'm done. I'm so sick of you. I tried to be nice. I tried to come back, submit myself to you. I couldn't do it now. No. See ya. Back out again. How many of you would be tempted to do that? You guys are way more spiritual than me. Either that or you're lying, I think. One of the two. Human nature says, no way would I want to submit. You see, I don't mind help with my choices as long as the other person is getting help with their choices. Can I get any amens on that? Amen. Yeah, as long as they're getting help with their choices, as long as God's holding them accountable, then I will do the part of my choices. But what about when they're not changing? Do I still say, God, thank you that you see me. Thank you that you strengthen me. Thank you that you care about me. Give me the strength that I need to make the right choices in this. Boy, that's hard to do. God sees you when you need help with your choices. Oh, sure, when you're the victim of other people's choices, God sees you. But God sees you when you need help with your choices. Which leads to this last lesson, which is this. God sees you. While God works out his purposes in the world, God sees you. While God works out his purposes in the world, God sees you. You see, God was doing something bigger here. This wasn't just about Abraham and Sarah and having a baby. This was about the miraculous thing that was taking place. God was giving them a child when they were almost 100 years old, but he needed to bring Abraham and Sarah to the place in which they were so broken, so desperate, that it was obvious this was purely a miracle. That's what God was doing in their life. And yet Hagar somehow gets wrapped up in this. Hagar's actions, or reactions in this case, caused trouble, but that really wasn't even the bigger purpose. The bigger purpose was God showing up and doing something amazing. And so that's what we have here. The angel added, okay, Hagar, because you're going back, I will so increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count. And then he gives the description of who Ishmael would be, which is a pretty sad description of who he would be. But he was quite the child, I guess. But God is saying here, listen, Hagar, I need you to understand something. There is a much bigger purpose here. You need to go back, because by going back, I'm going to bless your descendants. You see, if you stay on this road and you go down there and you get killed, because frankly, you really could get killed on the road to Egypt all by yourself, single woman, okay? You can go on that road and you get killed, but here's the thing. I'm telling you, it is through that baby that you think nobody wants that I'm going to bless the entire world. They're more numerous than they can count, and the entire Arab population, as far as we can tell, is a descendant of that baby. There's a couple Arab people in the world. And it all goes back to that particular day when God says, listen, I'm letting you in a little secret. How often does God have things in mind and in store for our purposes that he just doesn't even tell us about? And yet we're tempted to give up. We're tempted to say, God, there's no way you see what I'm doing. There's no way you see what I'm going through right now, because if you did, you would change it. And God says, I have my purposes. You see, there are purposes that are being worked out. And if you quit now, you will never see what's going to happen. If you just keep going, I see you, I see you, I see you. You see, we want God to deliver us from our problems. God, if you see me, please take the problems away. But instead, God reminded Hagar, and I think he reminds us, that he will bless us through our problems. You see, when did Hagar see the name of God, El Roi? It was in her trials. So often, the reason why we see God to be who he is because we go through trials, we go through difficulties, we go through challenges, and it is then that we're there with nowhere else to turn, and we see God in a whole new way. When we're comfortable, life is good, people are happy, everything is going great. I don't need God. Do you need God? Not really. At least we think. God is working out his purposes. We want God to deliver us from our problems, and God says, I will bless you through your problems. One of the things we talk about here, your mess is your message. Your mess is your message. What are the things you're going through? What are the things you've gone through in your life? And you think to yourself, God, what are you going to do with all this? And he says, watch me. Watch me. You think that's a terrible thing. Trust me, there's something beautiful that can come from this. God can bless through problems. I want you to turn to one other verse, 2 Chronicles chapter 16, verse 9. 2 Chronicles, if you can't find it, that's fine. There was a king by the name of Asa. He started out as a good king and ended up pretty poor, but it was in this that, going back to these Arameans, which Dee Dee talked about earlier, they were having some difficulties and challenges, and there was a time in which he was dependent on God and all those things. And so while he was dependent on God, he knew God was aware, and so he just kept trusting. God, I believe you. You can work through this. God, I believe you can work through this. But then he got a little too nervous about the enemy, and the enemy was barreling down on him. But rather than depending, he says, there's no way God sees what I'm going through right now. There's no way God sees it. And so he put his own methods to work, and he hired these other people, these other armies to come in and help him out, and sure enough, it goes poorly. And so God comes to him. Verse 7, at that time Hananiah the seer came to Asa king of Judah and said to him, because you relied on the king of Aram and not on the Lord your God, the army of the king of Aram has escaped from your hand. Were not the Cushites and Libyans a mighty army with great numbers of chariots and horsemen? Yet when you relied on the Lord, he delivered them into your hand. And here is a very famous verse. For the eyes of the Lord range throughout the earth to strengthen those whose hearts are fully committed to him. God is looking for someone who's simply willing to say, I believe you see this. I don't feel that you see this. There's a part of me that doesn't want to believe you see this, but I'm going to trust that you see it. And because I trust you see it, I'm going to continue to step forward in faith, saying, God, I believe, I will act based on the fact that I believe you are seeing what's going on right now. And God says, if I see that, man, I want to come along and I want to step in. And I want to encourage. And I want to strengthen. And it's only as we take those steps of faith. A step of faith, God, I believe you. And he strengthens that step. And a step of faith, God, I believe you. And he strengthens that step. He doesn't promise, remember, to fix all of our problems. But he does promise to give us strength through those problems. And so today, I guess I want to remind you, God sees you. He sees you. He sees me. He's always aware. When we become the victim of other people's choices, God sees us. Thank you, God, for that. Because, man, sometimes it feels hopeless. When you need help with your choices, when I need help with my choices, God sees me. While God works out his purposes in the world, God sees me. And so here at this end, I want to remind you of one thing. Remind you of one thing, and that is this. So often when we think of God sees me, we think of a God who's up there watching, keeping tally of all the things we did wrong. Yep, I saw it. Can't get away with that one. I saw it, I saw it, I saw it, I saw it. And it can tend to bring us to a place in which we say, oh God, I don't want you looking anymore. My life is not what it should be. And God reminds us, and through Jesus Christ, that every single one of your wrongs can be paid for or has been paid for. And if there's somebody who's sitting here today fully aware of the fact that God saw what you did last night, if you know that expression, God saw it. And if you're sitting here going, oh man, God, can you overlook that one? He says, no, I can't overlook anything. Every sin is important, and every sin is against my character. I can't overlook anything, but here's what I will do instead. I will give you Jesus. Jesus, my son, the Son of God. He will die in your place because that sin deserves death, but he will die in your place. And if you're sitting here and you need Jesus and you need that freedom and that forgiveness, he offers it. Please come and talk to me afterwards. I would love to tell you about how you can be free from this feeling that God is watching you and he's going to get you. Because once you have Jesus Christ, we move from, oh God, please don't see that, to God, thank you that Jesus died for that. Thank you that you are always seeing me. And so those of us who have him can then go to this last slide, which is your homework for today. What would you try today if you knew God was seeing the whole thing? If you knew God was seeing the whole thing, that conversation that you're going to have with that neighbor that's been driving you nuts, and you've been meaning to have that conversation, you're like, oh boy, how's that going to go? God sees it. What would you try? Would you try it if you knew he was watching? Would you try having that conversation with the parents or with the wife or the husband or whatever? Would you do it? Would you step out in faith, knowing that God's going to be with you and he sees you when you go and try to share your faith? Remember, we got City Fest coming up in just 2 weeks when you're going to go and give that invite. Is it just you who's going? It's not just you who's going. It's you and the God who sees you. What would you try today if you knew God was seeing the whole thing? Because I want to tell you, try it. He is. God sees. God sees. I'm going to close in prayer, and then we're going to have the band come on up here, and we're going to do our closing part of the song here. All right. Let's all stand together as we close in prayer. God, it is a great reminder. You are the God who sees. There are other gods, supposed gods in this world, but they're not gods at all. They are just simply demonic or whatever it is. But God, they can't see. They're not even real. And so, Lord, I just thank you for the fact that you are a real God who sees us, and not just sees us and is a distant God, but you are there. Just like Hagar with the angel of the Lord, you showed up. You reminded her. I pray that maybe today this message will be just like that angel of the Lord who showed up and was that reminder. I see you. If somebody out here today needs to hear those words, I pray that they would hear them and be encouraged and reminded you are there. I see you. But Lord, for the rest of us, I just pray that today would be a day when we would come to grips with that new reality, maybe a reminder of the reality that there's not a place we can go, nowhere, in which you are not there. May we rest in that. May we take comfort in that. May we have boldness and courage in that, because there's a world that desperately needs you. And so I pray that you would do that. Lord, help us to see beyond the victimhood. I pray that we would see beyond that and just be able to trust you no matter what comes along. So thank you. So God, we just ask you to give us boldness this week to try things because you see. In Jesus' name we pray. And all those in agreement said, amen.